show me your friends, and I'll show you your future. This is a saying that I picked up from one of my professors in Bible college. It speaks to the fact that we as human beings tend to be highly impressionable. We tend to become like the people that we surround ourselves with. And this is true for all of us, regardless of how old we are or what stage of life we're in. And so this means that we need to choose our friends wisely. We need to be conscious about surrounding ourselves with godly people who will build us up in the Lord. But today, as we continue through our series in the book of Judges, we're going to look at an example of a judge who failed to do this. Rather than surrounding himself with godly people who sowed into his life, this judge surrounded himself with people who were far from God. And this decision only created chaos and crisis in his life. The judge we're looking at today is Samson. We're first introduced to Samson in Judges chapter 13, verses 1 to 5, where it says this: "Again the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. So the Lord handed them over to the Philistines who oppressed them for 40 years. In those days, a man named Manoah from the tribe of Dan lived in the town of Zorah. His wife was unable to become pregnant and they had no children. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and said, 'Even though you've been unable to have children, you will soon become pregnant and give birth to a son. Be careful. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, nor eat any forbidden food. You will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and his hair must never be cut. For he will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines.'" Chapter 13 begins with the phrase, "Again the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight." And if you've been with us through this whole series in Judges, you've probably become quite familiar with that phrase, because we see it every single time we're introduced to a new judge. This phrase reminds us of this cycle of sin that the nation of Israel has been in. This cycle of sin where they fall into idolatry, into the worship of the false gods of the nations around them. And when they do, God hands them over to these other nations who begin to oppress them. And then Israel finally remembers the Lord their God that brought them out of Egypt and into the promised land, and they call out to him for a deliverer. But they only remain faithful to God as long as that deliverer is alive. But as soon as that deliverer passes away, then they fall right back into their evil ways. And this time when Israel falls into idolatry, it's the Philistines that God hands them over to. But there's something unique here in chapter 13 with the judge that God is going to raise up to deliver Israel from the Philistines. Something that separates Samson from the other judges we've seen so far is the fact that the angel of the Lord goes to his parents and foretells his birth. That's a pretty cool thing that not a lot of people in the Bible get. But there's also some unique requirements placed on Samson's life. The angel of the Lord commands that Samson's hair must never be cut. And if you're familiar with Samson's story, you might know that his hair does actually get cut. And that's what results in him being captured by the Philistines. And that's caused quite a bit of confusion for people, because a haircut doesn't really seem like a big deal. I get my hair cut every five weeks, and I have yet to be captured by any Philistines. So why is Samson's hair so important? Why does the angel of the Lord specifically direct Samson's parents that they must never let his hair be cut? Well, in order to understand this, we need to go to Numbers chapter 6, which outlines what it means to be dedicated to God as a Nazirite. Numbers 6, verses 1 to 8 says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. If any of the people, either men or women, take the special vow of a Nazirite, setting themselves apart to the Lord in a special way, they must give up wine and other alcoholic drinks. They must not use vinegar made from wine or other alcoholic drinks. They must not drink fresh grape juice, and they must not eat grapes or raisins. As long as they are bound by their Nazirite vow, they are not allowed to eat or drink anything that comes from the grapevine, not even grape seeds or skins. They must never cut their hair throughout the time of their vow, for they are holy and set apart to the Lord. Until the time of their vow has been fulfilled, they must let their hair grow long, and they must not go near a dead body during the entire period of their vow to the Lord. Even if the dead person is their own father, mother, brother, or sister, they must not defile themselves, for the hair on their head is the symbol of their separation to God. This requirement applies as long as they are set apart to the Lord. Number 6 shows us that taking a vow as a Nazirite was a special vow for the people of Israel, where they could set themselves apart to God in a unique way. And as a symbol of their consecration to God, there were some restrictions placed on them. They weren't allowed to eat anything made from grapes or go near dead bodies or cut their hair. And for most people who would take a Nazirite vow, they would take it for a temporary period of time. But Samson is unique in that he is dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. There's only 3 lifelong Nazirites that we see in Scripture. The other 2 are the prophet Samuel and John the Baptist. But something else that we're going to see in Samson's story is that he does a really poor job of fulfilling his Nazirite vows. When we compare this passage in Numbers chapter 6 with Samson's story, we're going to see that he breaks all of these laws, multiple times in some cases. He really doesn't seem to care that much about the fact that he has been set apart to God. And this part of Samson's life isn't really something that we tend to talk about too much. When most of us think about the story of Samson, we think about him as being a great hero in the Bible. What Samson is most famous for is his supernatural physical strength. As we read through chapters 14 and 15, we see stories of him killing a lion with his bare hands and slaying 1,000 Philistines with a jawbone of a donkey. And if you look at any picture in any children's church lesson of Samson, like the one they're using downstairs right now, they all portray Samson as being this big, burly guy achieving great feats of strength. But while Samson may have been a superman in muscles, he was a super wimp in morals. He was the kind of person who really just lived in the moment. Someone who was only guided by his immediate passions and lusts. And we're going to see that this leads him into some destructive relationships that cause him to fall away from God. Samson does not choose his friends wisely, and as a result, a love for God is not reflected in any of his decision-making. In chapter 14, verses 1 to 3, it says this: One day when Samson was in Timnah, one of the Philistine women caught his eye. When he returned home, he told his father and mother, "A young Philistine woman in Timnah caught my eye. I want to marry her. Get her for me." His father and mother objected. "Isn't there even one woman in our tribe, or among all the Israelites you can marry?" they asked. "Why must you go to the pagan Philistines to find a wife?" Now, do you remember what the angel of the Lord had said about Samson back in chapter 13? He said that he would begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines. But far from acting as Israel's deliverer, who was going to rescue them from the Philistines, What Samson decides to do instead is to marry into a Philistine family. And not only was that an issue for Samson individually, based on his unique calling from God, but it was also an issue for any Israelite in general. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 7, God gives this command to the people of Israel. When the Lord your God hands these nations over to you and you conquer them, you must completely destroy them. Make no treaties with them and show them no mercy. You must not intermarry with them. Do not let your daughters and sons marry their sons and daughters, for they will lead your children away from you to worship other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and he will quickly destroy you. In this passage, God tells the people of Israel that he doesn't want them to intermarry with the other nations around them, because he knows that if they do, then they'll grow spiritually complacent. God doesn't give them this command because he's racist. Rather, he gives them this command because he doesn't want them to adopt the pagan spiritual practices of the nations around them. He doesn't want these other spiritual influences coming into Israelite homes. And as we read through the rest of the Old Testament, you'll see that this concern is well-founded. Because this is exactly what happens. Israel falls into spiritual complacency, and they start to adopt the worship of the false gods of the nations around them. We've even seen that here in the book of Judges. And something that doesn't help with this is intermarriage with these other nations, because that just promotes further spiritual complacency. And this is something that's relevant for us to talk about in our lives today, because it's pretty common for Christians to marry outside of the faith. But when they do, it always produces spiritual complacency. It winds up with them having a lukewarm and superficial faith. And we can often justify the decision to pursue romantic relationships with non-believers by telling ourselves that they're really nice people, or that there just aren't any other unmarried people in our church. But can I encourage you today that we can trust God with our relationships? That God really does work all things for the good of those who love him. And if we seek to honor and glorify him in every area of our life, then we can trust that he will provide for us. And that's something that I can speak to from personal experience. Because when I moved to the small, tiny little town of Castor, I did not expect to find a spouse in the church that I was pastoring. In fact, many pastors actually told me that if I was going to pastor in a small rural context, I had better be prepared for a life of singleness. Because you don't often find young women in small churches like ours. But I guess God had other plans. So trust me when I say that we can trust God with our relationships. But as we see in Judges 14, Samson fails to do this. He insists that his parents arrange this marriage for him. And we're told in verses 5 through 9 that as Samson and his parents were going down to Timnah, a young lion suddenly attacked Samson near the vineyards of Timnah. At that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and he ripped the lion's jaws apart with his bare hands. He did it as easily as if it were a young goat. Pause. In what world is ripping a young goat apart normal? That's what I always wonder when I read this passage. But he didn't tell his father or mother about it. When Samson arrived in Timnah, he talked with the woman and was very pleased with her. Later, when he returned to Timnah for the wedding, he turned off the path to look at the carcass of the lion. And he found that a swarm of bees had ate some honey in the carcass. He scooped some of the honey into his hands and ate it along the way. He also gave some to his father and mother, and they ate it. but he didn't tell them he had taken the honey from the carcass of a lion. So we're told in these verses that Samson is attacked by a lion near the vineyards of Timnah. But do you remember back to the Nazarite vows in Numbers chapter 6? Nazarites were forbidden from eating anything produced by grapes. So what's a Nazarite doing in a vineyard? But then, after Samson has killed the lion, he returns and finds some honey in the carcass. And so he decides to take some and eat it, which is also a violation of his Nazarite vows, because he's not supposed to go anywhere near a dead body. But worse yet, he also gives some of that honey to his parents without telling them where it's from. And this suggests that Samson was aware that he was doing something that he wasn't supposed to, because he neglected to tell them where this honey came from. He was aware that he was doing wrong, but he wanted to cover it up. But Samson's moral failure does not stop here. When it comes time for the wedding, Samson is assigned 30 male companions who are kind of like groomsmen. But Samson decides to use this as an opportunity to take advantage of them and to rip them off with a bet. He does this by telling them a riddle based on his previous experience with the lion. In verses 12 to 14, Samson says to them, "Let me tell you a riddle. If you solve my riddle during these 7 days of the celebration, I'll give you 30 linen robes and 30 sets of festive clothing. But if you can't solve it, then you must give me 30 linen robes and 30 sets of festive clothing." "All right," they agreed, "let's hear your riddle." So he said, "Out of the one who eats came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet." Now, this is a pretty underhanded move from Samson. Instead of treating his wedding like a joyous celebration, he's just using it as an opportunity to take advantage of and rip off the people around him. And as you might expect, this only creates conflict and division. We're told that Samson's wedding feast lasts for 7 days. I would not want to pay the catering bill for that. And for the first 3 days, the groomsmen are frantically trying to solve the riddle, but they're unsuccessful. And then in verse 15, it says that on the 4th day, they said to Samson's wife, "Entice your husband to explain the riddle for us, or we will burn down your house with you in it. Did you invite us to this party just to make us poor?" Some friends, eh? Again, we see the need here to choose our friends wisely. Yes, Samson was definitely in the wrong by trying to rip these guys off with his riddle. But we also see that his friend's response is just to fight fire with fire, and that only ever escalates conflicts. Now, Samson's wife is obviously quite scared by this threat, so she begs Samson to tell her the answer to the riddle. And at first, Samson really doesn't want to, but after she nags him for the rest of the wedding feast, he finally gives in and tells her. So then she in turn tells the groomsmen. And in verse 18 it says, "So before the sunset of the 7th day, the men of the town came to Samson with their answer. 'What is sweeter than honey? What is stronger than a lion?' Samson replied, 'If you hadn't plowed with my heifer, you wouldn't have solved my riddle.'" Now, this is a bit of a strange response from Samson. I'm no marriage expert, but I'm pretty sure that if you compare your wife to a cow, that's bad. But Samson's response gets even worse from here. We're told in verses 19 and 20 that then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. He went down to the town of Ashkelon, killed 30 men, took their belongings, and gave their clothing to the men who had solved the riddle, because he had to settle his bet. But Samson was furious about what had happened, and he went back home to live with his father and mother. So his wife was given in marriage to the man who had been Samson's best man at the wedding. Now, as you can probably guess, having his wife given to someone else instead is not exactly something that sits well with Samson. So chapter 15 tells us that when he finds out about this, he goes and burns the grain fields, vineyards, and olive groves of the Philistines, and then proceeds to kill 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. What's unique about Samson's story compared to the other judges is that there's no kind of organized military campaign against the Philistines. We never see Samson leading an army of Israelites into battle. Instead, he just goes around throwing temper tantrums based on personal offenses that he has incurred. And what's interesting about all of this is that despite the fact that Samson just makes bad decision after bad decision, God still uses him to deliver Israel from the Philistines. And this shows us that God can work with us, or he can work in spite of us. God's sovereignty is greater than any of our decision making. And so even if we're not living in alignment with God, he can still work all things for his glory and goodness. Now that doesn't absolve us from the need to follow God. We still need to seek him and love him with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind. We are still called to obedience. But we can take hope in the fact that God is bigger than any of our mistakes, and that our slip-ups are not going to thwart any of his divine plans. Now, you might expect that Samson would learn from his mistakes and would choose his friends more wisely in the future. But that's not what happens. Because in chapter 16, we find him pursuing another relationship with a Philistine woman. In verses 4 to 6, it says, "Sometime later, Samson fell in love with a woman named Delilah, who lived in the valley of Sorek. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, 'Entice Samson to tell you what makes him so strong, and how he can be overpowered and tied up securely. Then each of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver.' So Delilah went to Samson and said to him, 'Please tell me what makes you so strong and what it would take to tie you up securely.'" Now you would think that at this point Samson would recognize this as a trap and would sever his relationship with Delilah and move on. But that's not what happens. Instead, he decides to play a little bit. He tells her that if he was tied up with 7 new bowstrings, then he would lose his strength. But that, of course, is a lie. So then he tells her that if he was tied up with brand new ropes, then he would become as weak as any other man. But that's also a lie. And finally, after she keeps nagging him, he gives in to her, just like he did to his wife back in chapter 14, and reveals his secret to her. He tells her about how he was dedicated to God as a Nazarite from birth, and that the symbol of his separation to God is his hair. And so if that is cut, then he will lose his supernatural strength. What we see here is that Samson has grown overconfident. He's not guarding the gifts that God has given him. And so he allows himself to be drawn in by this woman who is really just out to destroy him. Because Samson is not choosing his friends wisely and is not seeking to honor God with his life, he's blind to how destructive this relationship truly is. And then in verses 19 to 20, it says, Delilah lulled Samson to sleep with his head in her lap, and then she called in a man to have the 7 locks of his hair shaven off. In this way she began to bring him down, and his strength left him. Then she cried out, "Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you." When he woke up, he thought, I will do as before and shake myself free. But he didn't realize the Lord had left him. So the Philistines captured him and gouged out his eyes. They took him to Gaza, where he was bound with bronze chains and forced to grind grain in the prison. I think the saddest part of Samson's story might actually be in verse 20, where it says that he didn't realize the Lord had left him. Even though God has been working through Samson and has used him to do some pretty amazing things, Samson is not aware of God's presence in his life. He doesn't know what it feels like when the Holy Spirit has left him. And this presents a rather scary truth to us, that it's possible to be used by God while not being right with God. That having different talents, abilities, and strengths does not necessarily mean that we are following God and truly love Him with all of our heart, soul, strength, and mind. So the question that I have is this: how deep does our relationship with Jesus truly go? Would we be able to tell the difference if the Lord left us? This is a reminder for us that our spiritual formation, the relationship that we develop with Jesus, is not something that just happens automatically. Rather, it's something that we need to intentionally and consciously be growing through spiritual disciplines like prayer and spending time in Scripture. It's not something that we can just take for granted. Now, fortunately for Samson, our God is a gracious God who never leaves us nor forsakes us. We're told that one day the Philistine rulers hold a great feast to Dagon, their god, in their temple. And they bring Samson out to perform for them and to be their entertainment. But then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me again. Oh God, please strengthen me just one more time. With one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my 2 eyes." Then Samson put his hands on the 2 center pillars that held up the temple. Pushing against them with his bare hands, he prayed, "Let me die with the Philistines." And the temple crashed down on the Philistine rulers and all the people. So he killed more people when he died than he had during his entire lifetime. Now, something to note here is that while Samson does pray for the first time in his story in the book of Judges, I'm not really sure that this is a good prayer for us to model ourselves off of. Because Samson doesn't really seem to be praying with the best of intentions. He says in verse 28, "Let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my 2 eyes." What we see here is that Samson isn't really being motivated by a desire to love God and see Him glorified. Really, he's just being motivated by vengeance. Just like he had back in chapter 15 when he burned down the Philistines' grain fields. But the main thing that I want to highlight today from Samson's story is the fact that all of his crises begin with his relationships with Philistines. Whether it's his wife in chapter 14 or Delilah in chapter 16, all of the major issues in Samson's life stem from the fact that he fails to choose his friends wisely. He doesn't surround himself with godly people who are sowing into his life and who are building him up in the Lord. So as we end our service today, can I encourage you to surround yourself with godly influences? To make sure that your closest friends, the people that you confide in and who you go to for wisdom and advice, are all believers who will point you toward the Lord. Because we as human beings are highly impressionable. We become like the people that we hang out with. And this is why it's so important for us to choose our friends wisely and surround ourselves with the right people. And something that we've been talking about as a church board is the need for more Bible study groups in our church. The need for more small groups where we can build stronger friendships with the people in our fellowship. So I would like to just plant the seed this morning that maybe God is calling some of you to lead or host a small group. I'd encourage you to spend time in prayer as to whether that might be one way that you can build up the people around you. Amen?